jumped in a puddle. It's fun to do, isn't it? I like jumping in puddles. You know, we have a puddle in our driveway. Whenever it rains hard, we get this little puddle. But then the water runs off and the sun comes out and dries it out. And then it's gone. But what would happen if that puddle stayed? And every time it rained, it grew and got bigger and bigger. Well, that's just what happened in our story today. I am going to read the story called Rodney Robbins and the Rainy Day Pond. The author of our book is Kim Stegall, and it's illustrated by Bruce Day. Every time it rained, the street in front of Mr. Hamilton's tidy white house with a perfect picket fence became a pond. Not a puddle, not a pool, a pond. Some folks called it a lake, but they were fond of exaggerating, and the pond was taking over the neighborhood. One child lost a doll in the water. Do you see the doll floating there? Another lost a boomerang. Do you see the boomerang? That's that green U-shaped toy floating by the doll. It's also by the frog. You see him waving his hand there. That's a boomerang. That's a toy that if you throw it just right, comes back at you. And little Rodney Robbins, Mr. Hamilton's nearest neighbor, had nearly lost his brand new super duper rocket scooter with the optional flying sparks feature. Do you see Rodney's super duper scooter there, his rocket scooter? You see it there in the water? I'm glad that he didn't lose that. That's a fun name to say. Can you say that with me? Super duper rocket scooter. Well, the people on Colonial Avenue had tried for months to find someone to help solve the problem. Rodney's mother had called the City Works Department and the president of the Homeowners Association. Rodney had scooted to the mayor's office. I'd like to speak to Mayor Campbell, please. We have a problem on Colonial Avenue. There's a hole. Yes? Colonial. C-O-L-O-N-I-A-L. Oh, yes, very patriotic. Okay, I'll come back later. One day after a big storm, Mr. Hamilton checked his cherry tree for damage. He was examining a broken branch when he noticed 2 red sneakered feet protruding from a holly bush. Mr. Hamilton, the voice belonging to the sneakers said. Yep, answered Mr. Hamilton, continuing to inspect his tree. I have another idea about the pond. A good one. I wanted to tell the mayor, but his secretary just asked me where my mother was. The body belonging to the voice appeared. You want to hear it? Asked Rodney. Yep, nodded Mr. Hamilton, cocking his head to one side. And so it was that Mr. Hamilton, who had never protested much of anything, not even Mrs. Hamilton's tofu meatloaf, became convinced by little Rodney Robbins that something had to be done about that pond. Minutes later, Mr. Hamilton sent Rodney scootering home to ask his mother whether he and Mr. Hamilton could work on a special project. Soon, the unlikely pair disappeared into Mr. Hamilton's cellar. What do you see down there in the cellar, in that basement? I see paint cans, paintbrushes. What else do you see? Garbage can. What's Rodney doing? He's got a big hammer. He's hammering a nail into a piece of wood. I wonder what he's doing. What about Mr. Hamilton? What is he doing? Sawing that wood? Sawing that board? Wonder what they're working on. Well, from all over the neighborhood, you could hear this scritch, scratch, risp, rasp of metal against wood, followed by a bang, bang, banging. Paint smells wafted up the stairs and through the cellar door. Mrs. Hamilton wiped her hands on her apron and called, "Mr. Hamilton, you and Rodney coming up? Cookies almost done." "Yep," Mr. Hamilton grunted as his head appeared in the doorway. "We did it," announced Rodney. The duo walked straight past Mrs. Hamilton's homemade wheat German carob chip cookies and out into the street. Mr. Hamilton was carrying a large wooden board with a stake nailed to it. His blue eyes were fixed and his jaw was set. Rodney carried a hammer in the back pocket of his blue jeans, and they both had fishing gaiters on. When they reached the pond in the center of Colonial Avenue, the two paused ever so slightly before plunging into the water. "Brr," said Rodney. "Yep," said Mr. Hamilton. They walked until the water covered their boots and then lapped at their shins. Rodney handed the hammer to his partner. Mr. Hamilton held the hammer aloft and drove the stake down with as much force as he could. By now, a crowd had gathered on the shores of Hamilton's Pond, as it had now come to be called. "What are they doing?" asked Miss Kelly. "Rodney's up to something," said Mr. Jenkins. "And Mr. Hamilton, too," remarked Mrs. Elmore. Mr. Hamilton finished pounding and went back to inspecting his cherry tree. Rodney went back to scootering. Scootering on what? Do you remember the name of that special scooter? Can you say it with me? A super duper rocket scooter with the optional flying sparks feature. A roving reporter for the local paper was heading back to his office from a fire across town. He took a back road from Elm Street to Oak Road and found himself on Colonial Avenue, just as Mr. Hamilton's sign was posted. "Oh boy," said the reporter, "a fresh local story is just what tomorrow's newspaper needs." He grabbed his camera from the back seat of his car and shot several photographs of Hamilton's Pond and the new sign sticking up from the center. Next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with news. Everyone had seen the paper. You couldn't miss the story or the large picture of Hamilton's Pond and the sign that read, "No swimming or fishing allowed." In the picture, cars were driving right over the yellow lines in the street to avoid the water, and bystanders were gawking at the strange sight of a fishing hole in the middle of a busy street. The reporter had even captured a boy falling off his bicycle while staring at the pond. The following day, word had spread to several neighboring communities. Folks from all over came to have a picture taken next to Hamilton's Pond. Some brought goggles or fishing gear to make the pictures seem more realistic. It had rained the night before, so the pond had risen even higher. "What a great idea," said a visitor from 2 towns away. "You could sell souvenir hats and keychains." "Yep," observed Mr. Hamilton, who had ventured out to pull weeds. "Or carrot juice," suggested Mrs. Hamilton, wiping her hands on her apron. "Maybe," said Rodney. On the morning of the 3rd day, Mr. Hamilton was puttering in his petunias when he heard a rustling in the holly and saw 2 red sneakers under the fence. "Look, Mr. Hamilton," said Rodney Robbins, pointing toward the center of Colonial Avenue. Mr. Hamilton poked his head out from behind a lilac bush to see 3 large pieces of equipment descending on the pond. One looked as though it would suck water. One had a load of fill dirt. And one was preparing to lay asphalt. I think I see one other truck in that picture, a small bulldozer truck. Do you see that too? A man wearing a yellow hard hat walked over to Mr. Hamilton's yard. Sure sorry about all this commotion. We've been getting complaints for years about this mess, but no one seemed to pay much attention till this sign went up. Guess you'll be glad to see this crater filled in. Yep, agreed Mr. Hamilton. Whoopee! Hollered Rodney. You should have heard the mayor this morning. He called our office himself and sent us out here right away. Said he didn't want to get one more email or visit about this kerfuffle, he called it. Kerfuffle, that's a fun word, isn't it? That means a commotion, a big mess. And that's what was happening in the neighborhood. It was a kerfuffle. Say that with me, kerfuffle. Well, the man in the hard hat went back to work, and Mr. Hamilton went back to his petunias. Rodney remarked that the flowers looked especially nice this year against the Hamiltons' house. And thanks, Mr. Hamilton, said Rodney Robbins. You're good at listening. And before Mr. Hamilton could say, yep, Rodney pulled his super-duper rocket scooter with the optional flying sparks feature out of the bushes and rode off toward the park. Some time has passed now, and the new black asphalt has begun to fade to the steely gray of the street around it. But if you ever find yourself cutting through from Elm to Oak, you'll come to a large patch of pavement on Colonial Avenue that the whole neighborhood used to call Hamilton's Pond. If you wave at Mr. Hamilton while he's out inspecting his cherry tree, you might just hear him call, "Yep," as you drive past. And don't be surprised if nearby you see a spray of sparks and a pair of red sneakers. The end. That's a great story. They were able to solve that problem in such a creative way. Mr. Hamilton and Rodney Robbins were creative problem solvers, weren't they?